Greetings, everyone. This is Peg Brady from NOAA Fisheries, Office of Science and Technology, working remotely today. Thanks for joining us today for our monthly ecosystem-based management, ecosystem-based fisheries management seminar series. Today we're resuming our 2020 series with Heather Leslie, the director of the Darling Center at the University of Maine. And we are using these series to showcase excellent projects that are being implemented throughout the country that advance ecosystem-based fisheries management, and also to help increase awareness regarding ecosystem-based management across the country so that we can get better understanding of our marine ecosystems. This series is co-hosted by our friends at the NOAA Library, Katie Rowley, they're on the line. And the seminars are held, as I said, on the second Wednesday of each month from 3 to 4 Eastern Standard Time. Each presentation is publicly accessible, recorded, and archived. And for anyone who's interested, has colleagues that may not be available today, Heather's presentation will be available at a link that we'll provide later on at the Brown Bag website, the NOAA Library Brown Bag website. Following today's presentation from Heather, you'll be able to ask some questions using the chat function on your screen. And Katie will replay the question to Heather. And if it's a lengthy question, what we'll probably do is ask you to take it on, and Heather will be happy to answer any questions that are more in detail. But again, I want to thank our speakers and all the folks here today that are joining us, and we hope you are all safe and healthy, and we look forward to continuing this series next month. So Heather, we're going to turn it over to you. Heather is Midcoast, Maine, and she's going to begin her presentation. So thank you very much, Heather.
Thank you, Peg. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to everyone who is joining the webinar today. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to talk with you about research that I've been conducting related to ecosystem-based management in Maine over the last several years. And before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the many people who are contributing to the work that I'm presenting today. That's me in the upper left. And I co-lead this project with Joshua Stoll, another faculty member in the School of Marine Sciences at the University of Maine. And together we're leading what we call the Maine Coastal Community Resilience Project, which is funded through the NOAA Saltonstall Kennedy program and covers these three areas. Our goal is to generate and disseminate information that coastal communities can use to be more resilient, adaptive, and where necessary to transform in the face of environmental and economic change. And throughout this talk, I'm going to be giving some examples of how we're doing this work through these three primary activities. I'm trained as an ecologist, and Josh is trained as a social scientist, and we conduct a lot of our work in a participatory or engaged mode. What that means is that we're working directly with coastal community members, including municipal leaders and fishermen, and that group of people is in different ways contributing to the design of the research, the data collection, and also to the interpretation of our data. We have 3 additional co-PIs on the team who are all practitioners in fisheries management and marine and coastal management and development more broadly. Carl Wilson on the far left there is the lead scientist, director of the Maine Department of Marine Resources Scientific Bureau, and Paul Anderson to the right there is the executive director of the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, and Dana Morse, all the way to the right in green, is a Sea Grant extension agent who focuses on shellfish aquaculture throughout Maine. And our students, shown in purple, really blend this focus of research and practice and biophysical science and social science. They're all doing a mix of all those things, given our collective interest in addressing questions about adaptation and resilience in Maine and in other coastal places throughout the world. So as I said, together we're focused on generating knowledge that can be used to advance ecosystem-based management And by ecosystem-based management, I'm talking about approaches that recognize connections among different species, including people and other parts of the ecosystem, connections among the land and the sea, and connections between different sectors and uses of the marine environment, including but not limited to fisheries. Ecosystem-based management approaches are place-based, and they also encompass the varied values and benefits that people derive from healthy ocean ecosystems. And finally, ecosystem-based approaches attend to changing conditions so that we're able to manage better for both resilient human and ecological systems. And I know a number of you are very well read on this topic. On the right, I've listed a few key references that have been particularly formative in terms of the work that we've developed in Maine over the last several years. Under the broader umbrella of ecosystem-based management, we have pretty clear guidance at this point from NOAA through the NOAA policy on ecosystem-based fisheries management on how we can take an ecosystem-based approach specifically to fisheries at different scales. And that's really the focus of a lot of the work I'll be talking about today. And just to have us all on the same page in terms of a definition, as described in the 2016 NOAA policy, EBFM is a systematic approach to fisheries management in a geographically specified area that contributes to the resilience and sustainability of the ecosystem by recognizing the physical, biological, economic, and social interactions among the affected fisheries-related components of the ecosystem, including humans. So that's a mouthful. That's what we're trying to do. And if you take away nothing else from today, I hope that you'll begin to see ways that your own work fits in with this definition, perhaps in ways you hadn't thought about before, and also that there's a real diversity of approaches that we can and need to take in order to operationalize that definition. Three other key messages I want to leave you with are, first of all, that interdisciplinary research, like the research I'm talking about today, can support ecosystem-based science and management, particularly because it acknowledges those many connections among people, among other species, and among places. And we need to understand these connections in order to steward these systems well in a holistic manner. Secondly, the engaged research that I'm talking about, this participatory approach I mentioned before, enables us to ask and answer questions that we might not otherwise be able to do. And members of our team in particular are connected with the communities where we're working, not just as researchers, but also as shellfish farmers, as citizens and parents, and in other roles that we have within each of these communities. And finally, at the University of Maine in particular, we're really proud of the interdisciplinary and engaged approach to research and graduate training that we've engaged in actually for decades. So this project that Josh and I are leading is really a continuation of a decades-long commitment by the University of Maine to train graduate students as environmental professionals and have folks be fluid and fluent, not just in the science of ecosystem-based management and related topics, but also in the policy and the practice. And I'd love to talk offline afterwards with folks if you'd like to learn more about how we do that at UMaine. So just to give you a bit of a conceptual framework before we dive into the specific examples, if we're interested in understanding both these human and ecological dimensions of fisheries as charged by the 2016 policy, I assert that we need to frame our science as a science of the whole system. And that's a fundamental assumption that goes throughout this work. And by system, I'm referring not just to the ecological system, but to the social-ecological system, that big blue blob on your screen. And you can see that embedded within that large oval, the social ecological systems, there are two domains, the social domain, which operates at multiple levels, and also the ecological domain on the right, again, operating at multiple spatial scales or hierarchical levels. There's a number of different ways that the social and ecological domains are connected within these systems. And importantly for our purposes today, many of the connections are through ecosystem services like fisheries, not all, but many. The framework and others like it have been developed by multiple scholars and practitioners over the last decade in particular. And I think part of the reason this is such a rapidly developing field is we have this need in today's conditions to integrate science and deliver science in ways that really contributes to resilience and adaptation and transformation at both the community level and at larger spatial scales. And depending on your perspective, you might be more interested in ecological resilience or perhaps in how people are adapting to change. Our group is interested in both of those things, and particularly in how fishing-dependent communities here in Maine are interacting and intersecting with the rest of the coastal system. So just an outline for the remainder of my talk here. First, I'm going to introduce you to the social ecological systems framework in more depth. And then I'll highlight two examples of how we're using this framework to guide our research specifically in Maine. And I'll conclude with some updates on ongoing work in this SES frame, and also what I see as next steps for applying what we're learning in terms of policy and management. And my hope is this will lead to an open discussion. I know many of you are as expert in this as I am, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts and questions. So first, we're going to unpack the framework I introduced earlier. And this conceptual model was developed more than 10 years ago as part of a project I led with Karen McLeod to synthesize the science and practice of ecosystem-based management for the oceans. And it's certainly not the only framework of its kind. It was actually inspired in part by ongoing work of Lynn Ostrom, who in the same year, 2009, published a paper in Science entitled A General Framework for Analyzing Sustainability of Social Ecological Systems. And Dr. Ostrom's framework goes far beyond the bubble diagram that I showed you earlier that Karen and I developed, in that it really gives the ability for researchers to develop and test specific hypotheses about ecosystem and social processes, and also to synthesize knowledge across multiple disciplines. So the specificity of this framework, I think, is one of its great advantages, and it's a big part of the reason why I've come back to it time and again, both in this work in Maine and also in other places. So here I'm showing you a translation of Ostrom's framework specific to the coastal Maine setting. And you can see in the upper left in blue, the coastal marine system, and that's connected to the species that are fished in green, the target fish species. And then if you look on the other side here, in red are local and higher level fishery related institutions. And then connected to those are fishermen, and other key actors in that light yellow. And as an ecologist, I think of this as essentially the structure of the social ecological system. And before trying to understand the dynamics or the processes that are driving and contributing to this structure, we really need to just get a handle on what the pieces of the system are. And that's where we are in Maine right now, is defining and mapping the system. Once we've done that, we'll be able to move to the next phase of Ostrom's approach, which is to focus on what's in yellow here, the interactions among different components of the system, and ultimately how those interactions contribute to outcomes. Outcomes like revenue, food for fish, or excuse me, fish for food, and knowledge production. A lot of different outcomes we might think about, as I'll show you here in a moment. So in terms of each of those four dimensions I mentioned before, the ecosystem, the fished species, the institutions, and the fishermen themselves, those are highlighted in those different colors at the top of this figure, and they're given in the framework. And what we then do is we use the variables that Ostrom and her colleagues detailed in great depth based on decades of empirical work, not just with fisheries, but other systems. We choose the variables that are listed in each of these colored boxes that match up to our particular context. And then seek data that we can use to parameterize those variables. I'm not going to get into the details of this process today. This is very much the active part of our work here in Maine. But if you're interested in seeing an example of how this can be done from another place, I led an application of this framework to Northwest Mexico, and that was published in PNAS in 2015. So I refer you to that. An important additional point about this framework is it isn't just about the details of interactions between people and nature that are mediated by fisheries. There's also a recognition that context is really important, both ecological context and also social and economic and political context. And finally, again, there's a recognition that dynamics and outcomes are key. And I'd say in terms of the application of this framework, this is where the least work has been done. So it's an exciting area for future focus. So I delved into that depth with the framework because I think it can be quite a useful tool for situating both disciplinary and interdisciplinary work in a way that can help inform larger questions, whether it's implementation of ecosystem-based management in a particular place or development of an integrated ecosystem assessment through a NOAA-led process. It's a framework that has proven to be quite helpful to many people, and I'd love to hear others' reflections on that at the end of my talk. What I want to do now is briefly describe 2 examples of how we've been inspired by this framework to dive into the details of understanding social ecological systems related to fisheries in Maine. And the first comes from the work of Marina Cucuzza, who's about to defend her dual master's degree at the University of Maine. And she asked the question of how communities are preparing for change. And to answer that question, as part of this project, she conducted a statewide analysis of comprehensive plans. Comprehensive plans are developed by many communities throughout the country. In some cases, they're regulatorily required, but essentially they're documents that enable towns to map the assets they have, as well as their goals and their challenges, and to plan for the future. And they tend to be renewed every 10 to 30 years, depending on the locale. So what Marina did was use these plans as the source of data in order to examine how well different communities are preparing for change. And she scored each plan based on a series of social and ecological and economic indicators of resilience after some earlier work that was building on related work by NOAA scientists and others. And what she found is well described by this map. Communities really vary in Maine in terms of how they incorporate resilience principles in their comprehensive plans. This is a little bit busy, so I'm going to take you through it. First of all, if you look at the size of the pie charts, each one of these pie charts is a plan that Marina and her co-authors coded in detail, and the larger pie charts refer to places that have higher resilience scores. So essentially, at least on paper, they're more prepared to deal with change than the places that have smaller pies, lower scores. And you can see if you look across this map, across the coast of Maine, that there's a different emphasis among the places on ecological, social, and economic elements of resilience, and she was able to break that out in this paper that was just published in the Journal of Environmental Planning and Management. This statewide analysis was informed by Marina's engagement in one planning process in particular in the community of Georgetown. Over the course of about 18 months of her master's work, Marina served as a technical expert to the Comprehensive Planning Committee in Georgetown, and she worked particularly with the Marine Resources Group, assembling and analyzing and interpreting fisheries data so that the community could think ahead about what they hope to see in terms of their fisheries in the future, but also to understand how they had evolved through time. And this data analysis was supported by our SK Award and is part of a larger ongoing project to understand the diversity of fisheries in Maine and how they've changed through time. So a second example I wanted to share comes from work led by Joshua Stoll. And here, again, inspired by the social ecological systems framework, Josh led an analysis using Maine state fisheries license data. So not landings data, but license data. And he used network analysis tools to investigate the degree of overlap among the licenses held by different fishermen to answer the question, is aquaculture operating as an adaptation strategy for Maine fishermen? And the details of the analysis are available through the marine policy article that we published last year. But to cut to the chase, we found basically that few fishermen are using aquaculture as a diversification strategy to adapt to change. If you look at the left-hand side of this slide, you can see that the major state-managed fisheries in Maine include elver here that I'm pointing to, and lobster. And just below that, you'll see aquaculture, the aquaculture licenses in orange. And the thicker lines indicate stronger linkages among fisheries. So for example, many people hold both lobster licenses and these general licenses. Many people also hold lobster licenses and scallop licenses. Not so many people hold aquaculture licenses and really anything else. Another way to look at the same data is on your right there. And on the right, you can see the different fisheries that are shown as bubbles on the left. You can see them on the right all lined up, and their centrality scores are listed in order of magnitude. And you see that aquaculture has a pretty low centrality score, which means that it doesn't have many ties to other fisheries based on these licensed data. So this isn't to say that aquaculture isn't an important part of a diverse marine economy in Maine, but these data from fisheries licenses do not indicate that many fishermen are using aquaculture to diversify their activities. So it's opened up all sorts of interesting questions about who are the new farmers and how are they connected to the commercial fishing sector and more traditional marine uses. So before I wrap up, I want to mention two ongoing projects at really different scales that we're engaged in right now as part of this coastal community resilience project. And the first one is very local. It's actually right outside my window here at home. Together with several Maine towns, we are studying the health of town-managed shellfish resources in multiple estuaries, including the Damascotta River estuary right outside my window here. We began this work last summer, and we're using a combination of natural and social science methods to assess the number and diversity of fished bivalves in intertidal areas in this estuary and another nearby one. And we're also trying to understand how these shellfish populations have changed through time. The Damascotta River estuary is a little bit different than many other Maine estuaries in that it does have multiple species of commercial importance. The folks that are harvesting wild shellfish in this estuary, including one of our collaborators shown in the top right here, he's harvesting actually more oysters than soft-shell clams at this point because of the changing distribution of shellfish in this estuary. There's also quahogs and razor clams, but they're not really at numbers that make them commercially significant right now. So on the left, I'm showing a picture of UMaine students in the field, and that's when we picked up the recruitment boxes that we put out last November in the sleet and the rain. These boxes give us a sense of how recruitment of new individuals, particularly soft-shell clams, how that varies through space and time, and also how predation impacts young clams. And we complemented the recruitment experiments with population surveys. We're using established methods. We quantified the full size structure of populations of soft-shell clams and other harvested shellfish in the estuary. And finally, we also conducted local knowledge surveys, particularly with harvesters, but also with shellfish farmers and other local experts in order to better understand the current uses of these coastal ecosystems and how they've changed through time. So this is an example of work where we leveraged our initial SK project and were able to bring in other partners listed at the bottom there, and particularly to engage the towns. And local harvesters in the work. And as a member of the local Shellfish Committee, I can attest that we really need these data. We don't seem to have any existing surveys of the resource. And so the work that this project, or excuse me, the data this project is generating is really a game changer in terms of enabling more science-based municipal management of shellfish resources. So this is the local work that's ongoing. I mentioned at the beginning that we're mapping indicators of resilience and sustainability statewide, and that's an ongoing effort that all of the projects that I've just described contribute to. Here I'm showing one relevant variable, the port shed score on the left. And so if you look at this figure on the left, what this is the port shed of Stonington, Maine, which is calculated based on land license data and where all the license holders who fish out of Stonington, where they reside in terms of their home address. And you can see it might be a little bit far away, but you can see that while there's a lot of fishermen who live close to Stonington, there are actually individuals who live quite a long distance, all within that polygon, and commute to Stonington in order to fish. When you take a map like what's on the left and you put it together for every port in Maine, you end up with what's on the right. And this was an analysis that Josh led last year. And you can see on the right the color coding of local ports in the cool colors, which are primarily drawing fishermen from a fairly local area, versus regionally significant ports like Stonington that are drawing fishermen from a much larger geographic range. And so information like this is really important for all sorts of reasons in terms of resilience planning, community planning. It's also one of the variables that we need to parameterize in terms of implementing the Ostrom framework. We can think of this essentially as system size, where are people coming from in terms of fishing the resource. So in closing, I want to leave you with the following thoughts. I hope, first of all, that what I've showed has illustrated the diversity of ways that people can do interdisciplinary work and also engage with local community partners in conducting that work in order to support ecosystem-based management. And we need data on both the human and the environmental dimensions in order to understand how to implement these ecosystem-based approaches and include people in particular in stewardship. Secondly, truly interdisciplinary work is integrative and incremental. Some of the things I've shared with you are published, others are very much in progress. And the time and investment that it takes to do this work is not trivial, but I think the benefit in terms of the creativity and the applicability that results is well worth the effort. And just I want to end on a hopeful note. I think that it's really encouraging that we have the capacity to do this work. And Maine is certainly not the only place where this is happening, but it is there's some really exciting examples from throughout the state where knowledge co-production with scientists and community members and other types of experts is absolutely possible and can really be a game changer in terms of creating management regimes that are both locally responsive and speak to the national mandates like what we have in terms of ecosystem-based fisheries management in the US. And so with that, I want to acknowledge definitely the NOAA Saltonstall Kennedy program for support, as well as other sources of support and the many collaborators who contribute to this work, including my kids who've managed to remain pretty quiet wherever they are during this 30-minute talk. So thanks very much. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was wonderful. A great presentation. I really appreciate the more positive note too to end on, and particularly at this time. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. What we'll do is if you folks have any questions, anyone who's attending online, feel free to put your question in. And Katie, you're there online to replay the question for Heather. And Heather obviously has provided her email address there on that last slide. So if there's something in more detail or you'd like to follow up more directly with Heather on some of her suggestions with respect to their program, I'm sure Heather will be happy to hear from you. So I'll turn it over to Katie to see if you have any questions that you've seen online.
Thank you, Heather and Peg. We do have some questions online. The first one is coming in from Tracy Rouleau. First, she wanted to say thank you to Heather for a great presentation. But her question is, they've run into some of our local fisheries research relates using licenses to make inferences. In many cases, fishermen will hold licenses but may not use them or may only use them as needed, part-time, etc. Did you control for that possibility? And if so, how?
Thank you, Tracy, for that question. That's a fantastic question. That's actually the subject of Marina's third chapter. She's been very prolific the last couple of years. So it's a manuscript in prep right now, but you're absolutely right. There's a real difference between what you can learn from licensed data and landings data, and then how do you put that together in order to understand latency. And we're in a place, again, thanks to Marina's leadership, where we're able to do that now that we've combined with the support of this this project. We've combined federal and state fisheries data for Maine fishermen, and we can begin to ask those questions. And there's really quite high rates of latency. I know Marina's on the line. She's probably in a better position to speak to it than I can, but I'd be happy to follow up and connect the two of you directly if you'd like to learn more.
Wonderful. Okay, we have a two-part question from Bill Sanders. Are license fees in Maine a meaningful roadblock to fishermen's activities in different fisheries?
That is a really good question that I don't have the answer to. I know that others who are part of this project could better answer it. So if Bill, if you'd be so kind as to put your email in the chat, I'll make sure to connect you with both Marina and Josh, who have been doing analyses that are fishery specific and can really speak to that, because it's something that's nuanced among different fisheries. I do know that.
Wonderful, thanks, Heather. I will send along Bill's email and you can answer his questions.
Thank you.
There. Okay, Neil Strauss is asking, how might the hazardous algal bloom impact or influence the Coastal Resiliency Project?
That's a really good question. We haven't really delved into trying to map that through time and map the different species that are involved, or look at the spatial and temporal variation in terms of harmful algal blooms. We're fortunate to have Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences just downriver from the picture you're looking at and 3 miles away. So we do have a lot of very close expertise in this department. And actually, we've just begun an NSF-supported project on environmental DNA that has a strong focus on harmful algal blooms. So I expect that version 2 of the statewide maps that we're developing right now will probably incorporate harmful algae, but we haven't gotten to that yet. It hasn't been an issue that's come up a lot at the local level, but I think that's very much a function of where we're doing the local level work, because certainly at a state level, it's a huge issue.
Okay, thank you. I am reading these questions as they come in, everyone. So the next one is from Peter Hall. How predictive are your models?
The intention is not to be predictive. So the intention is to better understand the system, and ultimately a future goal would be to understand how different paths forward, different management scenarios might lead to different outcomes. But they're certainly not models that are being developed, say in the like EcoPath, EcoSim, or Atlantis models that have potentially a more prescriptive or tactical function, depending on how they're used. Our intention here is to better understand the elements of the system and the ramifications of potential interactions among them. If you're interested in thinking more about dynamic models that relate to what I've talked about today, I would encourage you to look certainly at EcoPath, EcoSym, and Atlantis models, but also at the suite of models that the Natural Capital Project has developed.
Thanks, Heather. Our next question is also from Heather Sadusky. Can you give any examples of what communities are doing to adapt to change? Have coastal counties, municipalities in Maine developed strategies?
That is a great question. We're in the midst of the Maine Climate Council's work, and I co-lead the Coastal and Marine Group together with Kathleen Layden, who directs the Maine Coastal Program. So we're actually in the process of assembling the knowledge of what is happening right now, but also thinking about what the potential is for future adaptive strategies in the face of environmental change in particular. I think there's a prime example that we've seen through the Shellfish project that I mentioned toward the end. Over the last 20 years, there's been a pretty dramatic change, according to the harvesters themselves, in terms of what type of shellfish are available for harvest. So it used to be that there were many more soft shell clams available, we've been told. And now, as I mentioned, many folks are catching more oysters. We're not catching, they're harvesting more oysters. And those oysters were seeded through the 7 or 9 shellfish farms that are on the Damariscotta River. So there's been an interesting shift in the species that are targeted, and that's certainly an adaptation to environmental change by that particular group of people. We're seeing some other adaptations in the shellfish farming industry itself. So folks are changing how they're growing shellfish in response to the climate impacts that are already observable in this part of the world. The waters have become more acidic. Storm events have become more dramatic through time. And that those shifts have caused some challenges in terms of cultivating shellfish in farming situations. And so we've seen farmers on this estuary and other parts of the state begin to adapt. So we're in the context of the Climate Council, but also the work I presented today, we want to be sure to capture these examples of adaptation in action. And we also want to try to elicit and work with community members to design new adaptation strategies into the future. So some of it is sort of retrospective, but there's also a large prospective component to the work.
Great, thank you. We have several more questions. The next one is from Beth Turner. Can you give an example of how the work you presented is or can be implemented in management? Are you targeting state fishery management, et cetera?
Sure. Yep. So at the local level, the shellfish data that we're gathering will directly inform the Shellfish Committee's allocation of licenses in 2021. And again, those data were not data that have been available previously. So as a scientist, I've been kind of baffled by it. We've been making allocation decisions without any data on the resource, and so we're moving into a new place where we have the potential to have information on the resource in order to make allocation decisions. One of the co-PIs for this project is Carl Wilson, who's the Director of Science for the Maine Department of Marine Resources. And so in working with Carl to develop this project and interpret the results as they emerge, we have the opportunity to gain insight from him and learn what the department finds most useful and most productive in terms of the work. And there's been a really nice back and forth there because of activities like the Shellfish Project, but also Marina's work in Georgetown, where we're talking with folks at the municipal level, where the state doesn't necessarily have the ability to be in continued conversation. And so we've been able to be at the boundary there and share state level data in ways that community members can more easily use it. And that's been really productive, and I expect it will continue to be so in the future. So it's been an evolving process, but definitely we're seeing interest and uptake of the information and the approaches that we're using at both the local and the state level.
Great, thank you. Helena Anton asks, have you been able to determine why fishers are not getting involved in aquaculture?
Not yet. So another student on this project is using a tool called the Q method to map the value landscape associated with marine aquaculture in Maine. And that's Melissa Britch, another one of our dual degree students. So she's getting a master's in policy and a master's in marine biology over these 3 years. And so through her work, she's had a chance to interview not just fishermen and current producers, but also people who are intersecting with the Maine marine aquaculture sector in a lot of different ways. And so we're certainly interested in why that's the case. And we all know people, we all know fishermen who have gotten into aquaculture. We can all point to colleagues and examples of folks who are doing that, but it's quite interesting that when you look at the data statewide, that's not the dominant pattern. And so it presents some interesting questions scientifically for sure, but also in terms of policy.
Great. Okay, thank you, Heather. Jocelyn Runbaum wants to know if you have any thoughts on incorporating expanding ocean uses into EBFM, thinking specifically about offshore wind.
Thank you for that question, Jocelyn. So I think there's a number of different ways to approach that topic. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would be focused specifically on ecosystem-based fisheries management, I would have been quite speculative or skeptical of that, given my core interest in thinking about connections among all different elements of the ecosystem and multiple sectors. That's why we wrote that book. That's why I devoted time to editing that book on ecosystem-based management of the oceans. But the great thing about focusing in on fisheries, particularly living here in Maine, is that they're important. They're important for a lot of different reasons, for food, for our economy, for our identity and our culture. And there also are substantial data to work with. And in my work on ecosystem-based management more broadly, I've been repeatedly surprised by how little data one can gather in other sectors, and tourism is one that keeps popping up in my work here, but also in Mexico is really, it's a lot harder to bring data together for that sector in the same way one can for fisheries. And so when we think about something like renewable energy development offshore wind or other modes, I think it's going to be it's going to continue to be very important to be sure that we have data-rich and data-poor methods to draw upon, because there's not necessarily the same availability of data for other sectors as there are for fisheries. I know that only is the tip of the iceberg of your question, but I'd love to talk more about it offline.
Great, thanks, Heather. Next question. Cosmin probably wondered, did your published findings translate into policy changes?
I'd say that's very much still a work in progress. The aquaculture findings have piqued people's interest and definitely in some ways buck the dominant narrative of why one of the reasons why aquaculture is so important in Maine and other places is the need to think about ways to diversify the marine economy and presumably ways for individuals to diversify. So that's playing out now, which is really exciting and interesting, I think, particularly for the students in the group. I see the resilience work that I presented, the Shellfish project and the statewide maps that we're working on, those are going to yield policy outcomes on the scale of decades. So fortunately, being based on the coast at the Darling Marine Center and in a institution that's dedicated to public service like the University of Maine is, I have time to invest and to wait and to try to be as helpful as I can for the long term. But I think a lot of policy outcomes really do take a lot of time to be visible. And it's a continual challenge to figure out how to best capture those, particularly when conversations are active as they are now in this space.
Great, thanks, Heather. Sarah Evil asks, is aquaculture planning in Maine being directly incorporated into EBM or EBFM planning?
Hi, Sarah. That's a great question. Is aquaculture planning in Maine being directly incorporated? Not much has changed in the 18 months since you left. I'd say it's still pretty well in its own lane in terms of state government. And if there's anyone from Maine state government who wants to chime in, please do. But just the way the Department of Marine Resources and many state and federal agencies are structured, they make it a little bit tricky for cross-sectoral collaboration and coordination. And aquaculture and commercial fisheries in our state are certainly emblematic of that separation right now. What's really exciting to me is that when you get on the water in a place like the Damariscotta River estuary that you're all looking at right now in my slide, all those things are happening right in front of you if you're standing on this dock. And so on the scale of municipal management or estuarine management, it's easier, I'm finding, to encourage people to get out of their lanes and to think about the connections among sectors. And certainly I've found members of the department to be open to that. It's just that they're managing through a set of laws that are very much sector specific, just as we find at the federal level. So you really getting out on the water is a good way to get around that.
Thanks, Heather. We do have 6 questions left, and we'll see if we can get through them by the 4 o'clock hour.
Okay.
Next up, would your system work for fisheries in other states? I'm assuming is the question. There's a little.
I think that remains to be seen, but I'd love it if folks would try it and let me know how it goes. I've been doing this type of work in Northwest Mexico for over a decade, and so this is an adaptation of many of the things that my colleagues and I developed in that really different cultural and ecological context. And so I think with every new place and new moment, you learn new things and need to adapt. And we're certainly finding that as this project goes along. But the Ostrom framework has been applied and published on literally thousands of times and in a lot of different ways. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to be inspired by the intention of this approach and find ways to make it work for where you are.
Great, thanks. Roger Griffiths has a question. Are you looking at resilience to certain stressors like shifting species distributions? And in general, are you seeing changes in community interest in preparing for future changes?
Thank you for that question, Roger. That is a really good question, and it makes me think immediately of Malin Pinsky's work and many others in his group who've specifically looked at how fish and fishermen are moving around and moving north, particularly in this region, but also on the Pacific coast. We're doing some of that work in Mexico, but we haven't gotten to it in Maine yet. And I'd say part of the reason why is because there's great work by people like Malin already underway. But also we're working at a pretty local scale in terms of trying to align our research questions with the local knowledge and interests of fishermen and other people at the community level. And so those questions are definitely being asked, and people are sharing observations of different species that they're catching than what they caught 20 years before, or some really strange southern species that are showing up more frequently than they used to show up. We haven't quite figured out how to capture all those observations and capitalize on them. At the state level, they're very aware of shifting species and indeed are opening up new fisheries. Black sea bass is an example that gets called out a lot, more southerly species that's now managed in state waters. But I think one of the exciting things about the local aspect of the work that we're doing with this project is that we're going to be able to elicit observations and ideas about how adaptation might take place, potentially more quickly than a state level assessment will be able to do.
Great, thank you. Ryan Maxwell has a rather long question, so I hope he doesn't mind if I cut it down a little bit. How was your data collected on centrality? Did you have access to license holder data, or was the data collected through interviews with a variety of players in the coastal zone?
Yes, so the analysis I showed you from the paper published in 2019 on aquaculture and other seafood production modes, those are data that were gathered at the state level, state license data. Through this project, we've also been able to integrate not just state and federal license data, but also clean that up and integrate it with landings data. So clearly there's a lot of issues of confidentiality there, and those are attended to in these analyses. But the exciting thing is now with SK support, we have the ability to ask questions about latency, like what Tracy was alluding to earlier, and also to get a more complete picture of how fishermen are fishing, both close to shore and then also in federally managed waters, and how those patterns shift through time and space.
Great. Julie Cherish has a question, but I believe it's a little more closely related to marinas, so I will send that to you offline. Susan and Blake was wondering if there are some ways in which this information can be used in a practical way to advance fisheries ecosystem management. Do you have some examples?
That's a very good question. So I hope I'll have the chance to come back and share something concrete with you in another 2 to 3 years. But at the local level, again, there just aren't surveys of shellfish or even compilations of landings of fishermen in a particular place. Until last year and the rollout of this project, the fishermen in Georgetown had a pretty hard time getting the data back that they delivered to the department in order to use it for town level assessments. So one thing that Marina did through her work in Georgetown was to work with fishermen and work with the Department of Marine Resources to package and deliver those data back in ways that could be used for town level decision making. So we're already seeing an impact in terms of fisheries and community planning, fisheries management and community planning. We anticipate that when we have the statewide maps that enable us to look at factors that contribute to resilience across the state, that those will be of interest to the department and other folks who are thinking about fisheries management at the state and even the national level. And exactly how they choose to use those isn't yet clear, again, because the ways that fisheries are managed are so much legislatively constrained. It requires some real experimentation and thinking outside the box to move toward these ecosystem-based approaches. And we have some great examples of how that's happening, but it requires time and creativity. I've talked about the Damascotta example plenty, but one other I want to be sure to acknowledge is the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative, which is an experiment in developing a research agenda for ecosystem-based fisheries management in Eastern Maine. And the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, together with the Department of Marine Resources and NOAA, are leading that effort, and a whole lot of us are involved in supporting it. and developing an EBFM research agenda, which ultimately will hopefully contribute to change in the water. But that requires, working outside and around carefully those legislative constraints.
Thanks, Heather. Last but not least, our final question is from Jerry Wiersma, and I hope I get this question correct. He asked, is there a way to implement bio-based building to make a more resilient coast to fight against coastal erosion and preserve the delta as fishing breeding ground?
Thank you for that question. It sounds like perhaps you're thinking about a different ecosystem than the ones I have the most expertise in. But yes, for sure, nature-based solutions in terms of sea level rise and dealing with storm events are really important. They're something that we're thinking actively about in terms of suggestions that'll go forth through the Maine Climate Council process, and certainly that's an area nationally that has received a lot of attention. I would encourage you to look at the coastal resilience work, both of NOAA, but also of nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy, if you're interested in learning more about nature-based solutions.
Thank you so much, Heather. There are no more online questions. I want to thank everyone for sticking around through all of the questions. And if you have a question and you haven't asked it yet, you can pop it in the question panel now, and we'll record that to pass on to Heather. But if not, I thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Heather and Peg.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to let everyone know our next presentation. First of all, thanks, Heather. That was outstanding. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all the folks that offered up questions. Clearly a very keen topic on a lot of people's minds. So I appreciate everyone's engagement. But just looking ahead to May 13th, same time, Wednesday afternoon, 3 o'clock Eastern time, we will have Mary Hunsaker from our Northwest Fisheries Science Center. And the title of her presentation is The Testing of the Leading Indicators for Marine Ecosystem Shifts. So some of you folks have had a lot of questions about ecosystem shifts, and I'm sure they'll be interested in hearing what Mary has to say. So that's May 13th, Wednesday at 3 Eastern time. And if you've registered, you'll get notices about those presentations. So again, thanks for everyone's participation. Katie, thank you so much for your help from the library. And again, Heather, wonderful job. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Yes, be safe, everyone.